This video is a review of the basic vocabulary and concepts of genetics. So remember, this is a chromosome, and as human beings we have 46 of these, and we have 23 pairs. So you get one of those from mom and one of those from dad, and on each one of them you have sections called genes, and these are what determine your traits. And so remember, you have 2 copies of every single gene. Now, an example of a gene might be hair color, so that determines a certain trait. But there can be multiple different versions of that gene, and those versions are called alleles. So for each gene, you can have 2 alleles, because you have 2 copies of every gene. Some of those are dominant, and we indicate those with a big letter. And that means that they always show up. And then they could also be recessive, which we show with a little letter, and that means that you have to have 2 of them. Because remember, you always have 2 letters, because you have 2 copies of every gene. And the combination of those alleles is called your genotype. That's what alleles you have, and we indicate those with 2 letters. So those are the 3 possibilities. And your genotype determines your phenotype, which is what you look like, your physical trait. So for example, brown hair, blonde hair, those physical traits. So let's look at how genotypes and phenotypes go together. So if black is dominant to white, if I have 2 big letters, so both of my alleles are dominant, I'm going to call that being homozygous dominant. Homo means same, so they're both the same and they're both dominant. And that is going to result in the phenotype black, because black is dominant. Now let's say instead I have 1 big letter and 1 little letter. We're going to call that heterozygous, hetero meaning different. And I still have 1 big letter, and that's all I need, because as long as I have 1 dominant, it's always going to show up with the dominant phenotype, which is black. And then finally, if I have 2 little letters, that's called being homozygous recessive. Again, they're the same and they're both recessive, and this is the only way that I'm going to get the recessive phenotype, which in this case is white. So let's look at kind of how that goes together with another trait. So tongue rolling is dominant. So I'm going to use a big R for if you can, for the allele you can roll your tongue, and a little r for the allele that you can't. So here are my 2 chromosomes. If I have 2 big letters, that's my genotype, and so my phenotype would be that yes, I can roll my tongue because I'm homozygous dominant. Heterozygous, again, you can still roll your tongue because all you need is 1. And then if you're homozygous recessive, that's the only way that in the phenotype the recessive trait shows up, and you cannot roll your tongue. And that is the basics of genetics.